My name is Sister Angela Marquez, and what I'm about to share with you happened on October 28, 2023. That date is etched into my memory, not just because it was the day the new pope was announced, but because it changed the way I understood everything I'd lived for. I was in my room at the St. Teresa Convent in upstate New York. The leaves outside had just started turning gold, and the halls were unusually silent that afternoon. I turned on the television as I always do during a conclave, expecting prayer, tradition, ritual, but never expecting him. I've watched these events dozens of times over the years. You pray, you wait, you wonder who the cardinals will choose, but you tell yourself you're not too invested. After all, we're taught to trust the Spirit. But as I sat there with my hands curled around a half-empty cup of tea, something stirred inside me. A heaviness came over me. Not dread, not excitement, but a strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Then the announcement came, Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The cardinal said the name, and for a moment it was like my mind blanked. It wasn't a name from some old Italian lineage. It wasn't a headline I'd read in passing. It was a name I knew, not spiritually, not politically, but personally. I knew it from the edges of a class roster, from essays written in quiet frustration, from long pauses after deep questions. Before I could even grasp what was happening, the curtain opened and there he was. The student who used to sit in the third row of my theology class, eyes locked in deep thought, wearing a plain gray sweater. And now there he stood on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, dressed in white, blessing the world. I stood up without realizing it. My cup fell to the floor and rolled under the chair, but I didn't care. My knees felt weak. My chest was tight. It wasn't pride. It wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper. Like my entire past had been pulled into the present all at once. I wasn't just watching a broadcast. I was watching my former student become the Pope. His name back then was Thomas Delgado. Just Thomas. He wasn't loud, he didn't try to stand out, and if you walked into my classroom on any random Thursday, you might have overlooked him completely. But not me. I paid attention to those third-row students, the ones who didn't need to prove themselves, but were clearly carrying something sacred. He always came in early, always had his books neatly stacked, and always nodded gently when I spoke, as if he was listening not just with his mind, but with something deeper. Thomas didn't chase recognition. He didn't dominate discussions. But when he did speak, something happened in the room. It was like the noise quieted, like everyone, even the sharpest seminarians, paused to hear what he had to say. His thoughts weren't lofty theological arguments. They were simple, heartfelt, and cut right to the core. I remember once we were discussing the suffering of Job, and he looked at me and said, "Sister, maybe the reason Job hurts so much is because it's the most honest book in the Bible." That moment stayed with me, not because it was academic but because it was real. He carried pain even then. You could see it in his eyes. But he never used it for attention. He used it as a lens through which he looked at God. That's how I knew he wasn't just studying theology to get a degree or a collar. He was chasing something more eternal. He was seeking to know God. Not in theory but in a way that would change how he lived, how he served. And I knew in that moment back in my classroom that something rare was happening in that young man. Now standing on that Vatican balcony, it was still him. The quiet fire. The heavy eyes. The same presence that once shifted the air in a small seminary classroom was now being felt by the entire world. And I was frozen, not in fear, not in joy, but in awe. Absolute, unshakable awe. I whispered out loud without thinking, "Dear God." I taught the Pope. It's strange because in the moment I saw him standing there in white, I wasn't thinking about titles or power. I wasn't picturing papal robes or grand councils or world leaders lining up to meet him. I was thinking about that one winter morning years ago when he stayed behind after class. The other students had gone off to lunch, laughing and shuffling papers, but he stayed. He waited until the room was empty, and then he came up to my desk and asked, "Sister, why does God seem so silent when people suffer?" It wasn't a test question. He wasn't trying to impress me. He really wanted to know. I remember the look on his face, like he was carrying a burden that hadn't let him sleep. And I remember thinking, this is a man who doesn't want to explain suffering, he wants to walk through it with others. That moment shaped how I saw him from then on. It wasn't about grades or participation. It was about the way he moved through the world. With empathy, with reverence. I could tell even back then that he didn't want to lead people from a pulpit. He wanted to kneel beside them in the dirt. He wasn't like the others. Many students came through those halls full of ambition, full of ideas for how to change the church, fix its problems, rise through its ranks. And that wasn't always a bad thing. Passion is good. But Thomas, he was different. He wasn't reaching for anything. He was listening. Listening for God, for people, for the silence in between. That kind of person doesn't just become a priest. They become something else. Something holy. So when I saw him on that balcony, blessing a world he had spent years learning to love quietly, I knew this wasn't just some dramatic promotion. This was the fruit of 1,000 small yes he had said along the way. Yes to discomfort. Yes to humility. Yes to a call that would never be flashy but would always be faithful. And I realized, maybe that's what God was doing all along in my classroom, preparing someone to carry a weight only a heart like his could hold. After the initial shock settled into my bones, I sat back down, barely noticing the tea soaking into the rug. The sound of the Vatican bells rang through the television speakers, but I wasn't hearing them anymore. I was lost in a flood of memories, little moments that at the time felt small but now glowed with eternal weight. I thought about the time Thomas gave a presentation on the prophets and ended it not with a grand theological conclusion, but with a simple statement. If prophets still exist, they're probably poor, tired, and being ignored. That wasn't just a clever line. That was Thomas. He didn't study scripture to win arguments. He studied it to learn how to suffer alongside others. I remembered the way he sat during lectures, never fidgeting, never distracted. He always sat upright but never stiff, and there was this focus in his eyes like he was trying to absorb every word and ask, how does this help me love better? He was the only student I ever saw underline his Bible in pencil. Not because he was unsure, but because he believed God might show him something new the next time. That humility, it's rare. It was rare then. It's rarer now. And it's exactly the kind of heart I imagine Jesus looked for when he told Peter, "Feed my sheep." What many people don't understand about seminary is that it isn't just about head knowledge. It's about formation, spiritual shaping. You walk in with ideas and you leave, if you're open, with scars. Some students fought it. Others coasted through. But the ones who let themselves be broken and reformed, they were the ones who emerged different. I had the privilege of seeing that happen in real time with Thomas. He let the Word of God undo him. He let his ego be stripped away so that something more enduring could be built. And when I look at him now as Pope Leo XIV, I don't see a man grasping for global influence. I see the same young man who once prayed quietly in the back corner of the chapel, long after others had left. I see the man who asked to go where no one else volunteered. And yes, I mean that literally. After ordination, when everyone was talking about assignments in the city, or cozy parish jobs close to home, Thomas went to his superior and asked for something different. He said, "Send me where I'm needed most." And they sent him to the mountains of Bolivia. Most people don't know that part of his story. It never made headlines and he never talked about it publicly. But I remember when the faculty first heard. One of the other professors mentioned it during a staff meeting almost casually. "Did you hear? Thomas Delgado asked to go to Bolivia." And for a moment the room fell quiet, not out of judgment but out of reverence. It wasn't the kind of thing seminarians did. That region wasn't safe. The living conditions were harsh. There was no glamour in it. No pulpit, no microphones, no polished marble altar. Just dust, hunger, and people who felt forgotten. And that's exactly where he wanted to be. He didn't go for a year and then come back. He didn't go to get a feel for missionary life. He stayed. For almost 2 decades. He learned the language. Not just Spanish but the dialects. He He didn't just memorize prayers, he learned how the people prayed. He walked with them, ate with them, buried their dead, baptized their children, and somewhere along the way he stopped being a visitor. He became one of them. That's the thing about real ministry, you can't fake it for long. Either the people accept you because they see your heart or they never let you in. They let him in. What I came to understand through watching his life from afar is that true calling doesn't need applause. It needs surrender. Thomas wasn't interested in titles or honor. He just wanted to be useful to God. That's why his priesthood had power. Not because he spoke loudly or carried a strong personality, but because he lived in a way that made people feel seen, heard, and held. His strength was in his stillness. His leadership came through presence, not performance. And that's why when I saw him standing on that balcony, I wept, not out of surprise that he was chosen, but because the world had finally seen what I already knew. He had become the kind of shepherd the church so desperately needed. A man who knew the word of God and the wounds of the people. A man who could sit with cardinals in Rome but still carry the prayers of villagers in his soul. And I sat there, hands trembling in my lap, wondering how many more Thomases have passed through classrooms like mine, quiet, sincere, unnoticed. And how many of them are out there right now saying yes to the unseen, the uncomfortable, the unwanted. Because that's where the kingdom lives. In the margins. In the shadows. In the places people forget to look. There was one moment that stands out more than any other. It wasn't when he was named a bishop or even when he became a cardinal. It was during an ordination mass a few years before all of that, when I saw him again in person for the first time in over 15 years. I had been invited to attend the ordination of a former student at a parish just outside of Boston. I didn't know Thomas would be there. As I slipped quietly into the back pew, content just to observe, I noticed 3 figures in the procession. One was the young man being ordained, another was the local pastor, and the third, walking behind them in a simple robe, was Thomas. My breath caught in my throat. He looked older, yes, a little more weathered, but his presence hadn't changed. He still walked like someone carrying something sacred. After the Mass, the room was full of laughter, congratulations, and the usual rush of people trying to take pictures and greet clergy. I stood off to the side, not one for crowds, and that's when he saw me. No hesitation. No polite nod. He walked straight toward me and wrapped his arms around me in a hug so full and honest, I felt my knees buckle. He didn't care who was watching. He wasn't trying to be anyone other than the student I once knew. And in that embrace I felt every year between us dissolve. He remembered. Not just me but who he was when I knew him. And that's the rarest thing of all. When someone climbs so high but never forgets where they first heard the call. We didn't speak much that day. There wasn't time. He was being pulled in a dozen directions as most clergy are after an ordination. But before he left, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for seeing something in me before I knew it was there." And that was it. Just a few words. But they meant more than any title or accolade ever could. I went home that night and cried, not tears of sadness or even pride, but something deeper. The kind of tears that come when you realize God used your small, ordinary life to shape someone else's extraordinary calling. And I knew in that moment I didn't need to teach another class or publish another paper. I had done what God put me here to do. Years later, when I saw the news that he had been named Pope Leo XIV, I didn't reach for my phone to call anyone. I didn't post about it. I sat in silence. And I thanked God. Not because the church finally had a humble leader, though it did, but because I had seen how the quiet work, the unnoticed work, the early mornings and late night grading and prayerful teaching had not been in vain. The world saw a pope. I saw a former student. And more than that, I saw the fingerprints of God all over his story and somehow all over mine too. In the days after his election, people started asking me if I always knew. Did you know he'd become pope? Did you see something special in him? And my answer was always the same. No, I didn't know he would become pope. I just knew he was faithful. So, he didn't shine because he wanted attention. He shined because he was faithful when no one was looking. And I think that's what God honors most. Not ambition, not performance. Just quiet, steadfast obedience. That's what Thomas lived. And that's what changed everything. He never talked much about his time in Bolivia, even when I pressed a little. That's how I knew it had changed him deeply. When someone has suffered with people not just for them, they don't need to advertise it. They carry it in their eyes, in their voice. I heard about his work there only through others, through letters from missionaries, through whispers among his order, through photos of him sitting in the dust with children, smiling with nothing in his hands but joy. That's the kind of priest and now Pope he is. Someone who lets the poor shape him, someone who doesn't bring the church to people as much as he becomes the church with them. That's the kind of leadership we need now more than ever. So no, I didn't know I was teaching a pope. I just knew I was teaching someone who truly wanted to know God. And now that the world is watching him, now that cameras follow his every move and his face is on screens around the globe, I still see the same Thomas I saw sitting quietly in my third row, pencil in hand, eyes open, heart wide. The world calls him Pope Leo XIV. I still call him Thomas. And when I pray for him now, I don't just pray for the leader of the Catholic Church. I pray for the young man who once asked, "Why does God feel so silent when people suffer?" Because now the whole world is listening for his answer. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. I hope you see, like I do, that the greatest callings often begin in the most ordinary places. If this testimony moved you, or if you've ever felt unnoticed in your own walk with God, remember this. He sees everything you're doing in faith. And one day, maybe when you least expect it, the seeds you're planting in silence will bloom for the world to see. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more testimonies that reveal how God works in hidden places. You never know when someone's quiet yes could change the course of history. God bless you.